The Chronicle of the Copper Standard. It began with a decision so subtle that most citizens never noticed it. A single decree, tucked inside a stack of legal reforms, changed the metal that defined an entire economy. Silver, long the backbone of trade, was quietly replaced with copper for daily transactions. Officials called it modernization. Merchants called it efficiency. But beneath the surface, the shift carried consequences far larger than anyone imagined. To understand why this transformation mattered, we must return to a time when metals were more than commodities, they were the language of trust. Silver meant stability. Gold meant sovereignty. Copper, though essential, had always stood in the background, a supporting character in the theater of commerce. When the crown elevated copper to a place of prominence, it rewrote the hierarchy of value, sending ripples through markets already strained by conflict and scarcity. The first reveal begins with the reasoning behind the reform. Silver reserves had dwindled after years of war, trade disruptions, and lavish spending by the ruling elite. Mines once rich and reliable now produced barely a fraction of their former yield. Faced with shortages, the Treasury sought an alternative that could stretch its resources without appearing weak. Copper was abundant, easy to mint, and most importantly, cheap. By shifting to a copper standard for everyday transactions, officials believed they could preserve their shrinking stores of silver for diplomacy, defense, and international trade. Then came the second beat. The new copper coins entered circulation, fresh and gleaming, stamped with symbols meant to reassure the public. At first, the transition seemed smooth. Markets adjusted. Prices remained stable. Citizens accepted the change as a necessary adaptation to uncertain times. But observant merchants noticed subtle shifts. Copper's value depended not on scarcity or prestige, but on trust, and trust can erode quickly. In border towns, foreign traders hesitated to accept the new currency. In rural villages, elders muttered that copper was a metal for tools, not for savings. And in city markets, buyers began comparing the weight and quality of their coins with a skepticism that had never accompanied silver. The contradictions multiplied, a currency too cheap to command respect, yet too essential to reject. Quietly, the first fractures appeared. Counterfeiters, sensing opportunity, flooded markets with imitation copper coins nearly indistinguishable from the real thing. Prices crept upward as merchants demanded more currency to match the perceived decrease in value. The Treasury insisted everything was under control. But the Chronicle of the Copper Standard had only begun to write itself, and its next chapters would test the very foundation of the kingdom's economy. The strain became undeniable when merchants across the capital reported a troubling pattern. The new copper coins were losing purchasing power faster than officials would admit. Bakers raised prices to compensate for the swelling volume of currency. Carpenters demanded partial payment in silver or goods. Fishermen, whose livelihoods depended on cross-regional trade, found their copper coins rejected in neighboring ports. The reform that promised stability now cast a shadow of doubt over every transaction. As the reveal deepened, scholars conducted tests on the circulating coins. Their findings confirmed what many suspected. The copper used in minting varied in purity from batch to batch. Some coins bore a noticeably different hue, others weighed less than those minted only months earlier. Whether caused by hurried production, supply shortages, or intentional dilution, the effect was the same: trust in the new standard weakened with every inconsistency. Inside the Treasury, conflict took shape. Reformers argued that the system simply needed time to stabilize. Traditionalists countered that abandoning silver had been a reckless gamble, one that placed the entire economy at the mercy of a metal too common to command confidence. Heated debates filled the corridors of government, each side warning that the other's path would deepen the crisis. Tension escalated further when guild leaders petitioned the crown to restore silver for large-scale transactions. They argued that copper lacked the gravitas needed for long-term contracts and cross-border negotiations. But the Treasury, its silver coffers dangerously thin, refused. Admitting weakness would invite political rivals to probe the kingdom's vulnerability. Beyond government chambers, the impact spread. Farmers struggled to buy imported tools when foreign traders demanded payment in silver or gold. Urban laborers, paid entirely in copper, found their wages eroding week by week. Some shops began posting dual prices, one for silver, one for copper, exposing the widening gap between perception and policy. The Crown dismissed such practices as unpatriotic, but enforcement proved nearly impossible. The situation worsened when an influential coin scrutiny guild released a report documenting a surge in high-quality counterfeits. Their conclusion was blunt: the simplicity of copper minting invited exploitation on a scale unseen in the days of silver. Competing forgeries circulated so widely that even seasoned money changers hesitated to accept payment without careful inspection. Markets slowed, then stalled, as buyers and sellers argued over which coins were legitimate. Fear seeped into neighboring realms as well. Some border states imposed restrictions on copper coin imports. Others demanded conversion fees so steep that trade dwindled to a fraction of its former volume. The kingdom's economy, once fluid and interconnected, now moved like a clogged river, heavy, unpredictable, and prone to sudden breaks. Inside the mint, workers whispered about inconsistent directives. One week called for thicker coins, the next for lighter ones. Supervisors kept records locked behind doors reinforced with iron bolts. Rumors spread that the Treasury was preparing to alter the coinage again, though few knew how or why. By now, the copper standard no longer represented reform. It represented uncertainty. And as frustration grew, the kingdom edged nearer to a moment when doubt would ignite into open crisis. The crisis struck its first true blow when a coalition of major guilds announced they would no longer accept copper coins at full face value. Their declaration spread through the capital in minutes, echoed by shopkeepers, artisans, and caravans preparing to depart for distant markets. In a single afternoon, copper lost the illusion of stability it had clung to for months. Prices doubled. Then tripled. And with each increase, the kingdom's confidence fractured further. The conflict erupted openly when citizens crowded the steps of the Treasury demanding answers. Officials insisted the reform was sound, blaming temporary disruptions and malicious speculation. But these reassurances carried no weight. People could see the truth in their daily lives: their wages shrinking, their savings eroding, their goods costing more each week. The copper standard, once a symbol of resilience, now felt like a trap tightening around every household. Inside the royal court, panic sharpened into accusation. Reformers blamed the mint for inconsistent production. The mint blamed the Treasury for impossible deadlines. The Treasury blamed merchants for spreading fear. Each faction defended itself with fervor, refusing to acknowledge the scale of the unfolding disaster. Yet behind the closed doors of emergency councils, everyone understood the same unspoken reality: the kingdom had overestimated its ability to redefine value. Foreign powers sensed weakness. Envoys arrived with carefully crafted offers: loans backed by silver reserves, trade agreements that favored their interests, or protection pacts disguised as assistance. Their proposals came with conditions subtle enough to seem reasonable, yet binding enough to strip the kingdom of influence. Accepting them meant survival. Rejecting them meant isolation. The Crown hesitated, aware that every choice carried consequences that would echo for generations. Markets descended into chaos. Merchants began hoarding silver, refusing to release it except at exorbitant rates. Farmers sold crops only for barter or foreign coin. Caravans rerouted to avoid the kingdom entirely, unwilling to accept payment in a currency they no longer trusted. In border towns, citizens organized informal exchanges based on weight rather than denomination, undermining what little authority the Crown retained. The build-up intensified when an explosive document leaked from within the Treasury. It revealed that officials had anticipated the instability months earlier. Their internal memos warned that copper reserves would struggle to keep pace with production demands and that counterfeiting would escalate rapidly. Instead of slowing reform, the Treasury had accelerated it, hoping momentum would mask vulnerability. When the memo reached the public, outrage erupted with a force as potent as any rebellion. Crowds marched through the streets holding coins aloft like accusations. Artisans hammered copper into symbolic chains. Farmers displayed sacks of worthless currency at the gates of the capital. Every protest carried the same demand: restore silver, restore stability, restore trust. But the Treasury had no silver to offer. Admitting that truth would shatter the kingdom's sovereignty. And then the blow that transformed crisis into catastrophe: a major port city announced it would no longer recognize copper coins in any trade transaction. The decree severed one of the kingdom's vital arteries, choking the flow of goods and revenue. Within hours, other cities prepared similar announcements. The copper standard had not merely faltered, it had begun to collapse under its own weight. The kingdom now stood at the edge of a precipice. Tension gripped every institution, every household, every market stall. The next decision, whatever form it took, would determine whether the realm could reclaim its footing or fall into economic freefall. The storm that copper had summoned was now fully formed, and the kingdom could no longer outrun it. The breaking point arrived when the crown finally faced the truth it had evaded for months: the copper standard had collapsed beyond repair. After days of mounting unrest, the monarch appeared before a packed assembly: nobles, guild leaders, provincial envoys, and citizens who had traveled for miles to witness a moment that would decide the fate of their realm. The hall vibrated with tension. No decree could reshape public sentiment now. Only honesty, or the lack of it, would define what happened next. The climax began with a confession. The monarch acknowledged that silver reserves were nearly exhausted and that copper had been elevated out of necessity, not strategy. The treasury had hoped the public would adapt. Instead, the reform had exposed fragility long concealed beneath layers of confident rhetoric. For the first time, the court spoke plainly: the economy could not survive without restoring genuine value to its currency. What followed was a storm of reaction. Guild masters demanded immediate minting of a mixed standard coin backed by whatever silver remained. Provincial envoys accused the crown of deception. Merchants called for the resignation of treasury officials responsible for misleading internal reports. The assembly teetered on the edge of chaos until a proposal emerged, one bold enough to shift the momentum. The kingdom would abandon the pure copper standard. A new coinage system would be introduced, carefully weighted, transparently minted, and backed by a publicly audited reserve of silver and foreign-held assets. Copper would remain in circulation, but only as a subsidiary currency, no longer the foundation of daily trade. To regain trust, the mint would open its operations to independent inspectors. The treasury would publish monthly accounts. And in a gesture of accountability, senior officials involved in suppressing early warnings were removed from office. Outside the capital, the response was immediate. Protests softened into cautious curiosity. Merchants resumed limited trade. Foreign states acknowledged the reforms, some even offering temporary stabilization agreements to ease the transition. The kingdom, though bruised, began to steady itself. Markets remained volatile, but no longer directionless. For the first time in months, hope threaded through the tension. The resolution unfolded slowly but decisively. New coins, heavier, brighter, unmistakably authentic, entered circulation. Citizens lined up not to protest, but to exchange their flawed currency for something they could once again believe in. Trade routes reopened. Guilds restored wages. And though silver remained scarce, its presence, measured accurately and overseen transparently, became enough to anchor the new system. The Chronicle of the Copper Standard closed not with triumph, but with clarity. Lessons had been learned at a cost the kingdom would not soon forget. Value cannot be manufactured through decree. Trust cannot be forged from abundance alone. Stability requires honesty, both in metal and in motive. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future.